Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session this afternoon. Today's session, we are joined by Gaurav Dubey. Gaurav is an evidence lead in education and is also the head of English at King Edward VI Handsworth School for Boys. Gaurav, could you tell us firstly a little bit about you and your role, please?
Okay, firstly, thank you for having me here today. As Tracy has said, I'm an evidence lead in education with the Education Endowment Foundation, and the role of an evidence lead in education is to work with a particular research school. I work with one in Nechells, where we really sort of disseminate evidence, look at the pros and cons of the evidence and the research that's out there, to just help schools to become more research informed and really think about their own contexts, and how they can apply that evidence with fidelity for their particular school. And so it was all about being sort of evidence informed rather than being evidence led, as it were. I'm also, as Tracy said, a head of department. That's a very hard job, as you know, having been a head of English. So all the things in terms of what we're doing now, our priorities, trying to reach our vision of ensuring our students are culturally engaged and informed is basically what I'm doing now, as well as all the thousands of admin tasks that you have to do as a head of English, some of which, I'm not going to lie, are pointless, but there we go.
You don't sound bitter at all, Gaurav, about that. Yeah, okay, and I think you accurately say there are so many challenges, especially being in a role as a middle leader. You've kind of got what you know at grassroots level the students need, and obviously being more evidence informed in that as well. You can get some really compelling arguments about why change should happen in your schools, but also you've kind of got those pressures from the senior leadership team will have a very different kind of more global overview about the direction of travel for the school. So understandably, really challenging job, and I know you're doing a sterling job as well. So talk to us a little bit about your context then. So you spoke earlier about how important it is when people are research informed to think carefully about the context in which they're working. What's your context?
It's a really interesting one, actually, because I suppose you can split context into two things: the school context, the wider issues, and then something that's English specific and English related. Now, we're a grammar school, and so people often have this assumption that we have really, really bright students, and we do. That's not a lie, but we also have students who have been so heavily tutored that actually their ability to work independently and their resilience is something that we have to sort of invest a lot into. And our school's quite unique in many ways, in terms of being a grammar school. Rather than taking the top 20%, we take the top 40%, which means that we have some sort of variation in our students' sort of results when they come into school as well. We also recently started taking students via a catchment areas, I should say, which means that we have a real big difference between those who are well off and those who are disadvantaged as well. And so there's kind of like a big disparity between that. It's a real cultural melting pot. We serve some of the most affluent wards in Birmingham, Edgbaston being one, and we also serve the poorest ward in Birmingham, which is Winton Green. And so it's a very sort of divergent place. And in terms of English specific context, the majority of the students who come to this school are very sort of mathematically, scientifically minded. English is not a big priority to them or their parents. The 11+ exam that they have to take really only looks at the surface level, the comprehension in terms of reading. So they come in with those sort of negative attitudes towards English, and they actually have a really poor reading for pleasure culture at home. Many of them don't own their own books. They don't go to the library, and if they do own a book, it will be sort of like your Peppa Pig ABC books that they got when they were younger, which I don't think is going to really give them the level of challenge that they need at secondary levels. So it's quite a sort of interesting context.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it? Sometimes on the outside, you can make a judgment about a type of school, but actually once you scratch the surface a little bit and you realise actually there's some complexities in terms of the issues or problems that could emerge based on that, and based on that versus the assumption that people make. Okay, you spoke a little bit about some of the changes that have been made in terms of your context and the changes in the context that have happened over the last couple of years, especially in terms of admissions. Are there any other ways in which your context as a department have differed over the last sort of 5 years or so?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot. I mean, I'll start off with what I was kind of talking about before in terms of the catchment, but it has meant that, you know, we have a higher number than average disadvantaged students than most schools, and that number is interestingly dropping. But what we do have are students who are right on that borderline. You know, you know, something could go horribly wrong and they would be, you know, classed as disadvantaged. Those students can't afford the trips, they can't afford those extracurricular things, even though they don't qualify for that extra sort of funding. And so that makes it quite complex and quite interesting. But what I will say has changed is that, in spite of that, we have parents who really want the best for their kids, and this means that we have a really sort of good working environment, because the students know that they have another stick, which is their parents, really, to make sure that they're doing the best that they can. And so they might come from these, you know, bordering on disadvantaged backgrounds, but they don't see that as being a disadvantage. They see that as a opportunity to propel themselves. So for us as a department, we were talking about how inspiring that is for us, to see that, and it kind of makes us demand more of ourselves, so we can give more to the students and their families. You know, I mean, it's not like that 100% of the time, but with, you know, with the majority of our students who, you know, this is going to propel them to a different future. We also have seen a sort of shift in terms of our examination results. We went from, in 2016, and I say we were a grammar school, having 1 A star. That's across language and literature. And then now, of course, you know, we're getting 57% of our results are nines and eights, and students are performing above their target grades, because although we are a grammar school, their target grades do range from fours all the way up to nines, based on their sort of starting points at Key Stage 2. And so, you know, we've seen an improvement in terms of that. But also, one of the biggest improvements that we've seen is in terms of their attitudes towards reading while they're at school. We always have to start afresh when they come into year 7, but the majority of our students have a much healthier relationship with reading as they go through the school. For that's a real big sort of lever for our students to propel them, in you know, into the future. And there are other things, of course. We have less experienced teachers, and so sometimes we have to work much harder in terms of our English department, in terms of subject knowledge and upping that subject knowledge, and really using our senior teachers to help coach, I guess is the best word, our teachers as well. So that provides its own challenges.
Yeah, good. And that kind of segues on nicely to the next question about your kind of key challenges as a department as well. We've spoken about this kind of cultural melting pot that you've got at the school, some of the issues regarding relationships with reading over time. You've got that kind of pressure from parents versus you know, very different starting points. So all sorts of challenges. But what would you say are your kind of key challenges as a department that you're trying to look to research to support you in kind of solving some of those issues?
Well, we have a number of issues, and we only work on sort of 3 things over at a time. The first of those areas that we're currently looking at is oracy. Oracy is something that we've well embedded in the department in terms of dialogic approaches. It's something that we're good at. It's something that Ofsted have picked up on. But we recognised recently that just because on the outside it looks like you're doing something well, you have to still keep digging. And one of the areas in terms of oracy that we need to work on is that rhetoric, is that ability to debate. Sorry about the shakiness of the screen.
That's okay, don't worry.
You know, the ability to debate, the ability to have an informed opinion, you know, and not just have an opinion, you know, to have it truly informed. That's something that we're working on at the moment. Because we know that it will help them, yes, academically, in terms of answering, you know, those transactional writing and all those sorts of things. But beyond that, our context, our students don't tend to have opinions,
Mm.
you know, to the point where their future marital partner will be decided for them, and they won't make that decision themselves. So I think it's important that we kind of use that as a lever for agency, just
Yeah.
beyond academia. The second thing that we're looking at as well at the moment is vocabulary. That's something that we know is such an important lever. You know, the research tells us that, you know, your vocabulary at the age of 5 is actually the biggest predictor of your future success. And you know, we have 44% of our students are EAL learners, and none of them are at the early stages of learning English. But English for a lot of them is transactional, and
Mm.
so that knowing the nuances of vocabulary and words and developing that word consciousness is something that is really, really important for us. And our third main priority as a department is that coaching, is developing that leadership, and we're at the very early stages of that as a
Mm.
department, and that's simply because we know, again, because evidence and our own experience tells us that the biggest place that we can make an impact is not in interventions, is not in the extra things that we do, but it's in
Yeah.
the classroom. And so
Mm.
we need to constantly be working on getting our on improving our practice. There are so many other things that we need to work on as well in terms of diversity and things related to that, and understanding what diversity actually means in our context.
Yes.
But we're not stepping forward with diversity yet until we've um, improved our own subject knowledge
Mm.
of what's available, of what our students' needs actually are.
Yes.
Because we've got a lot in terms of race, in terms of looking at sort of colonialism and all that sort of thing. But when it comes to gender, when it comes to queer theory and those sorts of things, we need to upskill our knowledge. We need to upskill
Mm.
and be aware of our biases before we even start moving forward with that
Absolutely.
ourselves.
I think
So
what you've said there's, sorry, Gaurav,
no,
what you
carry on.
yeah, well, I think what you've said there is really interesting, isn't it? And again, comes back to some of the challenges of middle leadership, which is that what it will feel like is that there's an urgency to solve some of these bigger issues and problems. And I think you're right in saying, well, yes, we need to do that, but not yet. It's not the
Yeah,
right time to tackle that issue, because it's not, you know,
yeah,
the groundwork hasn't been laid, or we're not ready. And
yeah,
I think it's a really good thing to have that autonomy as a subject leader to say, well, no, I'm not going to force this at this point because we need to do X, Y, and Z in order to get into that position. And
absolutely.
it comes back to, I know the EEF really keen on models for implementation, and that's
Yeah,
so crucial, isn't it? And especially as a
yeah,
middle leader, thinking in those ways.
yeah.
Okay, so this is a bit of a longer question, but I
Mhm.
think it comes with a kind of preamble, which is that what we know of education, and I know you've been doing it for some time in the same way that I have, it been in the classroom, it can feel a little bit like we're reinventing the wheel, or things are coming back again with a different guise or under a different name. And that can, of course, make people a little bit jaded and perhaps fatigued by change or constant change. What I certainly find at the moment, in just scoping things out, is that this idea of being evidence led or evidence informed could appear to be the next kind of big thing.
Mm.
And firstly, could I just ask you to tell me what's the difference between being evidence led and evidence informed, and what do you think are the dangers of this kind of approach?
Okay, I think when you're talking about evidence, first you've got to think about the two areas of evidence. So there's the wider research, the wider things that are out there. Um, the multiple reports and things that you get, or a meta-analysis of a particular thing. So for instance, if there was a meta-analysis of learning styles, I'm not sure there is one, to be honest, but that in itself is some sort of evidence, and the evidence will either be in favor or not in favor of that particular thing. But then when you're thinking about being evidence led, it means you're completely driven by the evidence that you have in front of you. And so, if I give you an example, the Oxford Smart Oxford Smart curriculum for English have come up with something that an English curriculum at Key Stage 3 that is very much evidence based.
Mm.
They have 6 pillars. Oracy is one of those pillars. Knowledge is one of those pillars. Skills, all the best things that make a good curriculum are part of those pillars. And they have your ready-made to go resources, your ready to go lessons, assessments, all those kind of things are put in there. And that's very much an evidence-led, if you were to follow that with full fidelity, sorry, it's very much an evidence-led package that you could use, that could be successful, particularly if you have a department who are not as strong or as able in terms of the subject knowledge, or perhaps are not subject specialists. So it could
Or
work
require that scaffold or structure, right? I imagine.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because it includes the CPD that goes with it and all that sort of stuff as well. And that's being completely driven by the evidence. Being evidence informed means you look at the wider evidence, but you look at the context and you look at your own experience, and you use that to help make your decisions. You're not driven solely by the evidence, but you are driven by all those other factors. Just because something has worked in a particular school, for instance, doesn't mean that it's going to work the same way in your school. So being evidence informed is really having an understanding and really dissecting that evidence before you even start implementing any aspect of that evidence, and thinking about how that would work in your school as well. And both have their advantages. Being evidence led and being evidence informed both have their advantages, because for instance, in our school, we use a platform called Reading Plus. We have full fidelity to that particular platform. That's very much an evidence-based platform, and it gives us the evidence that we need to think about the areas of weakness that our students have in their reading, and then we can plan that on a weekly basis. But we also are very much evidence informed. So for instance, in terms of the stuff that we're doing with vocabulary, lots of people talk about the Freya model and using that to help teach vocabulary, but actually sometimes compliance doesn't always mean that it works well. When we started to unearth and dig the evidence, it was actually morphology and etymology that were and directly teaching those that works best with our students in terms of developing word consciousness, far more than a Freya model could. A Freya model is great for non-examples, but just because it's being done well across a school, like it was being done across our school, doesn't necessarily mean it's having the desired impact. And so compliance is great, but not if it's without the impact.
Absolutely.
And the one thing that I would say, that there are of course dangers when you are being evidence led, because you can use that to confirm a bias. I think the best way of sort of thinking about evidence is you have predictions, and like a scientist, you're trying to disprove that prediction. And if that prediction isn't disproved, if you like, then you know that that's an area that you do need to address. And so when you're looking at evidence, whether it's contextual, whether it's wider research, you have to take time to digest that and look at the flaws, look at the red flags. Who is the author? If, for instance, you have Guy Claxton talking about the importance of learning habits, someone who's heavily invested in that, and you use his research to say actually learning habits works really well, then you haven't done the wider sort of, you haven't looked at the opposite side, you haven't looked at,
There's that kind of importance of being professionally skeptical, isn't there? And whenever you're kind of presented with some research that people are saying, no, this works, put it in your classroom and it'll be the panacea to fix all of the issues that you've got in your classroom. There has to be a professional skepticism, and that's not somebody having a moan, that's somebody saying, hold on a second, let's interrogate this and see whether it is something that really works in our context, and whether it serves our students now, knowing that the context is always shifting. There's a really helpful diagram. I'll send it to you after this, actually, and send it to people who are watching this film, called That's a Claim. I don't know if you've seen it.
No, I haven't.
But it's a set of questions that educationalists should be asking themselves when they come up against research, and it's things like, how consistent or how much was this a sustained project over time, or what were the control groups, what were the variables, those sorts of questions that we should be asking. I suppose people watching this, though, Gaurav, would be thinking, that's all well and good, but when on earth am I going to get the time to think that critically about an aspect of my practice? How do you do that as a department alongside all of those other things that you were talking about having to do earlier?
I mean, there's a really good question, because it's actually taken us a long time to get to that particular place. You know, this hasn't just happened over time. A lot of it means that you have to scale back first. There's a lot of work coming out of Australia as well about the importance of de-implementation. And so all the faff that we had, that we were as a department putting into, you know, our department, we had to remove that first.
When you say the faff, what sort of things was that then?
So, for instance, having really sort of specific ways of doing learning walks at one time. So, you know, we had a very much kind of like a tick box list of doing. We've completely changed the way we do learning walks now. You know, made it much more lower stakes, and actually use that as part of our evidence to drive the decisions that we make, rather than actually just saying it's about compliance. It's actually about being more sort of nuanced than that. There were other bits of faff that we had. For instance, when we were looking at developing reading for pleasure pedagogies and filling in your reading record and all those sorts of things, which was actually sounds really good because it was evidence for Ofsted, but it was bad for the kids, because the one thing that was stopping them from having pleasure in what they were reading was having to fill this sort of thing in. And it actually took teachers time away from being able to look at that research, etc. as well. But
sorry to interrupt or interject there. I think that the key question that heads of department could ask themselves is, who's the audience for this? You know, if I'm asking people to pop things on bits of paper or get evidence for, you know, who's the audience, and does it have an impact on outcomes? Because if it doesn't, let's strip it away, and then again allow time for this sort of critical thinking about practice.
Absolutely. I think a lot of it though does come down to the middle leader, and I know it's the middle leader kind of driving that, because a lot of our teachers out there, particularly those who are not new to the system, who've been here a long time, actually have never truly been given the opportunity to be treated as professionals and actually engage with the evidence that you know, that's in front of you. When we first started looking at you know, the evidence that was out there, the wider evidence, and just looking at that to kind of develop our thinking, not really develop any sort of priorities, but just to develop our thinking, was back in sort of the about 2015, there or thereabouts, where we looked at some of Alex Quigley's blogs as they were then, and then Andy Atherton, who goes as Codextrus on Twitter, you know, because I knew there and then that my department would be more willing to listen to people who are English specialists, who themselves engage with the research themselves, who write about how they've applied that research, because that's ultimately what they want to know. They want to know how they can apply it to the classroom, and rightly so. But then you build slowly. Every time before anything in our department even goes to the implementation phase, we trial it first. And it seems such an obvious thing to do. You trial it with a couple of classes, see how that works, because the trial actually isn't about seeing what goes well, it's what's gone wrong.
What you learn from it.
Exactly what you've learned from it, and whether or not to pursue it further. You know, when we first started looking at dialogic teaching, one of the first things that we recognized was that our students could really not talk. So we needed to give them sentence stems, and that was the result of the trial, was that actually we need to look at giving them sentence stems and modeling it for them, to actually show them how it's done. And then, you know, when people come in now, we had a visitor yesterday from Ulverston Academy talking about how the students in year 12 just talk so much, you know, and it's like squeezing blood out of a stone in their own school. But that hasn't happened by magic. That's taken years and deliberate kind of teaching of that.
And again, that research that came out this week about accent bias, and also research about how kind of disadvantaged some children born through COVID have been in terms of their language acquisition. Now, these are all things that will come into, I say, fruition, but they will become more aware of them in
Yeah.
10, 11 years time when we're dealing with the fallout from that. Brilliant. That's great. So you've spoken at length about, you know, the benefits of research, some of the drawbacks, some of the ways in which we should be cautious when putting things in place. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you've made changes in your own department based on the research that you have you've kind of read or used?
Yeah, I mean, I've got so many that I can mention that
Just
it's
one
kind of.
example is fine.
Yeah, I think I'm going to really sort of look at sort of what we did with our curriculum, you know, and what makes, if you like, a good sort of curriculum at first, because there's a back in, you know, 2018 or whenever it was, when Ofsted first said that they were going to start looking at the curriculum in more detail. Loads and loads of people started publishing blogs and started really talking about curriculum, and many of them were coming up with different ideas, different philosophies, a skills-based curriculum, a knowledge-based curriculum, and all these things were starting to come together. And what I noticed were that some people were following one particular example. So you know, some schools were like, right, we're going to take the mastery model because this is what will work for us, and so on and so forth, and do all that sort of stuff. Other people were talking about focusing on the skills and getting the skills set right, and there was this huge sort of extremes of thought, and what I started seeing, particularly with other schools within the foundation that we were in, were that they put these curriculums together, having read about something from one particular example. The teachers didn't have the subject knowledge to deliver it well. They didn't really understand where that curriculum came from. It wasn't well thought out. And so for us, what we started to do was to start thinking about the mechanisms of what makes a good curriculum, you know, before we even started looking at what makes a good English curriculum. So we looked at the work of, you know, leverage leadership. Is it Daniel Chiga? I don't know how to say his name. Some of his work as well. We also looked at the ideas that other people were drawing in, David Didow, etc. But also then looking at the wider research, the research studies of good curriculums, and then using the EF toolkit, which was very different then to what it is now. And we looked at what would be the mechanisms of a good curriculum for students in our particular setting. And so for us, what we then started to do was that was kind of like the academic research. We looked at what our students were coming in with, their funds of knowledge, which I think is such a wonderful phrase to use. You know, when we think about students not being deficit, you know, Sonia Thompson often goes on about students coming with their own funds of knowledge, using that to think about their experiences of English, to see how we could you know, use that and leverage that to make improvements within the curriculum. And then sort of like the third and final sources of evidence was to look at what universities were doing. What do they do in their first, second, third year? And then we planned back from that. That process took 2 years. It took 2 years, whereas other schools had kind of had put their curriculum together. And as we'd finished, those schools had to redraft their curriculums again, and they had to redo it. And actually, we make changes to our curriculum regularly. And some of the conversations that Mary Mitre has in Curriculum Hut with Claire Hill, some of the key questions for us, you know, although that's more about people's experiences, I guess, rather than just the wider evidence as well. It's really good for us to interrogate our curriculum and what we're offering, sort of like on a regular basis as well. So that's really helped with us. But there are so many other things. Our reading for pleasure pedagogy, what we've kind of put in place, that's all come from the works of Teresa Kremin, the UK Literacy Association. Do be careful, by the way, if you ever Google UKLA. I tried to ring them up once, and I accidentally contacted the United Kingdom Lubricant Association. So that's just my
That's a great
stage
warning, Karen. Good to
uh,
know.
but you know, you, you know, but there are so many different places.
Mm,
And the one thing you need to be aware of, I think, when you're looking at evidence is that there are so many different people telling you so many different things
yes.
that you need to, when you're looking at it, think about the things that are most appropriate for your context, that
Mm,
you know will work for your students, so
yeah.
that you don't become overwhelmed by it. Taking that time to explore the evidence is so important.
Mm. Yeah, I think there's so many useful things that you've just said there, but I think that point about the danger of becoming overwhelmed by what's
Yeah,
there is so easy to do, because people's educational thoughts, that they will fight their corner quite
yeah,
fiercely for that, and to promote that, and therefore sometimes it's really difficult to treat that critically, especially again if you're time poor, or perhaps
yeah,
the system that's in school doesn't always lend itself so easily to that. I think there's something really crucial that you've just said, is this point about a process taking 2 or 3 years.
yeah,
And it takes real courage, I think, sometimes, if you've got a system, which we often do have with your PDM cycle and perhaps school development cycles lasting a year. We
mm,
almost expect them to fit into these kind of neat pockets of yearly things that happen. But
yeah.
best processes, best implementation takes longer than that.
And
Um,
it's interesting you mentioned that, because in my school we've changed our whole performance management system.
mm,
It's now performance development,
yes, good.
and the idea that those targets don't finish in July,
Yeah.
but some of them are ongoing. So one of the targets that I have, and we only have two targets, which I
Mm,
think is, and none of them are results based,
yes,
which
good.
again is interesting. It's all about developing your um, capacity as a teacher within the classroom, and then your
Mm,
wider interests as well.
yeah, yeah.
So I think having that classroom based objective is so important,
Mm,
because undoubtedly that's where you're going to make the most impact, and then
absolutely.
having that other one again is important as well,
Yeah,
for you to develop your professional interests.
yeah, absolutely. And I think what we've learned, especially in being more research informed, is that there are so many variables that are at play in a child's kind of acquisition of knowledge, skills, understanding, that it's very difficult to judge the efficacy and effectiveness of a teacher based on a percentage of how many got however many sevens, eights, nines, whatever. So I think it feels as though things are moving in the right direction,
Yeah,
and does almost give license for teachers to be more creative in the way that they implement change, but also get some expertise and really become experts in particular areas in the classroom.
absolutely.
Okay, so what sort of advice would you give to a teacher who wants to become more evidence informed? Where's the place to start? Because if you Google educational research, or if you're in the chartered college and you Google and you put in there search engines, whatever it is that you want to find out, it can be really overwhelming.
Yeah,
And which bits do you trust? Which bits don't you? Where do you start?
I think firstly as a teacher, and I'm not biased in what I'm about to say, but I would go to the Education Endowment Foundation, have a look at their guidance reports in an
Mm,
area that you're interested in. So if it's literacy, have a look at their guidance report on literacy. If it's metacognition, have a look at their report on that. It's put in a way that is simple, um, and a way that, like any sort of non-fiction text, if you like, you can dip into the bits that are interested in,
yeah.
dip out of the bits that are perhaps less useful, and are not going to you know help you as much. That's sort of like the first place that I would go to, but then you kind of start developing a little bit more interest as you're going along. I, for instance, was very sort of interested in the stuff that David Didow was bringing around, and you could tell that he is a very passionate individual, but secondly he also has a lot of what he does is very much in terms of his curriculum plans, which he shares freely, are very much evidence based,
Mm,
focusing on memory, recall, and building knowledge as well. So I think if you're an English teacher, he's certainly somebody I would look at as well. Doesn't mean that you'll agree with absolutely everything that he says. I
mm,
know that I don't, but you don't have to. That'll sort of help you as well. But if you know that there are people in your school who are engaged in evidence, who really have a good understanding of that, then I would go to them as well, and ask them to give you a bit of guidance as well. I mean, we've obviously, a lot of schools have started not classroom, sorry,
The
teaching.
CPD license.
Yeah, CPD libraries as well, and those are always brilliant places to go to. And I think if there's one final thing, is the Inaction series by Tom Sherrington and various other authors. I think that they take the evidence and they show you how that works in the classroom.
Yes.
And for me, that's been brilliant. One of my favourite ones is a generic teaching and learning one by Nimish Ladd about the Marge model. Um, uh, of it in action, and it's just brilliant. It's what we as an English department hook most of our teaching and learning principles on, because it works well for our department, our students, our staff, and our parents, and so it's really is worth looking at those in action series as well. Yeah.
That's great, brilliant, thank you. I suppose this is a sort of similar question, but what about if you were trying to encourage teachers to think more critically about their practice? And that's a difficult thing to get right, especially as something that teaching is such a personal endeavor, isn't it? And if you are constantly self-critical about your practice, that can be quite damaging. But equally, self-criticism can only get you so far. So what advice would you give to the teacher who's thinking, do you know what, I think I'm ready to be even more critical about the way that I operate as a teacher in the classroom? What sort of advice would you give to them?
This for me has probably been the biggest sort of the best thing for my teaching. List all the areas that you're critical of in terms of your own teaching, in terms of the things that you feel that you want to upskill yourself on, or you feel like you're not doing well. Once you've done that, you might have a list of, I think I had a list of 13 things. Circle the one thing that you think is going to make the biggest difference and just focus on that. And that one thing can make a huge difference to your practice. So one of the things that I really needed to work on in terms of my teaching, I had loads of things, but the one thing I knew would make the biggest difference is my questioning. That's what I worked on. That's what I focused my evidence and research around. Was on the sort of was my questioning, and questioning is now one of my strengths. And I'm talking about, this wasn't back in the last few years. This is something I've been doing for a long time. I just didn't know. I was looking at the evidence around it at the time, because that way of talking about teaching just wasn't around back in 2006.
Yeah.
Makes me feel old. Back at that particular time. So focus on that one thing, and then work on improving that one thing. And it's so interesting. That one thing makes a difference to about 7 or 8 things on that particular list.
Yes, yeah.
And so, that's what I would focus on.
Yeah, and I think interestingly, sometimes really hard to see the interdependence of lots of those aspects of our practice. Teaching is a really difficult skill to master, and it is something that's a real craft, isn't it? You've got to craft it over time, but then knowing that you're spinning all of the plates at the same time is a real challenge, and can become overwhelming. But I think that's great advice to actually confront some of those things, and if they are blind spots in your practice, to say, well, actually, I'm going to tackle that now and do something about it. That's brilliant. So have you got any final advice then, being research-led, research-driven? What are your kind of final takeaways that people should listen to?
An interesting one. My sort of final advice is really just do one thing at a time, and remember that if it does take time, that's not a failure on your part. That actually is showing you that fidelity to the actual process. I think for me, one of the biggest things that can help you is the implementation wheel from the EEF, which talks about to explore, prepare, do and
review,
deliver and then review. It's actually the explore phase of that takes ages. It takes a year, it takes 2 years. Then preparing it a little bit slightly less time, and then the delivery, because you really thought about all those mechanisms. Because the moment you try to get overwhelmed, and the moment you try and do every little thing, you will struggle, and it will have no impact.
Yeah.
So little things.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Gaurav, and all the best with the continuing work, what sounds like really exciting work in your department and in your role as an evidence lead in education. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.